military specialist for Carleton County, military historian for Carleton County. I'm going to give you the next presentation on Canada in the First World War. So this is the timeline. This is the next on the timeline of major battles of the First World War that I'll be talking about tonight. The Somme, very heavy battle, a lot of death, a lot of wounded, a lot of mud, a lot of carnage. The 4-long-month Battle of the Somme was fought from July 1st to the 18th of November 1916. Allied commanders sought to relieve pressure on the French defenders of Verdun to the south by inflicting heavy casualties, heavy losses on German forces farther north, and drawing German reserves into the battle. The joint Allied offensive planned for French forces to play a prominent role, but heavy casualties at Verdun reduced their ability to participate. As a result, British and other imperial forces under the command of Sir Douglas Haig assumed responsibility for most of the front. German defenders along the Somme had constructed deep dugouts that were difficult to find, much less to destroy with artillery fire. Many of the hundreds of thousands of British shells fired before the attack were inoperative duds due to quality control problems in their manufacture. Others lacked fuses sensitive enough to explode on contact with barbed wire, which further reduced the bombardment's effectiveness. Because of this, many German machine gun positions and dugouts remained largely unscathed, deep rows of barbed wire uncleared. So the Somme took place from July 1st, 1916 to November 18th, 1916. Along the Western Front, the Canadian involvement in the Battle of the Somme was part of the larger British Allied effort. The Canadian Corps, consisting of 4 divisions, played a significant role in the later stages of the Battle of the Somme. They were involved in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, which began on September 15, 1916. This battle marked the first use of tanks in warfare. The Canadian Corps was tasked with capturing the village of Courcelette and surrounding areas. The Canadians faced a well-fortified German defense, including machine guns and trenches. Despite challenging conditions and heavy casualties, the Canadian Corps made important gains during the battle. The success of Flers-Courcelette demonstrated the Canadians' effectiveness and resilience in the face of formidable opposition. Throughout the later stages of the Somme campaign, the Canadian Corps continued to be involved in various engagements, contributing to the overall efforts of the Allies. The Battle of the Somme was brutal and protracted. It was a terrible conflict, with a high cost in terms of human lives on both sides. It's important to note that the Somme was just one theater of the First World War, and the Canadian military was involved in various other battles and campaigns during the course of the war. The experiences of Canadian soldiers at the Somme, like those of soldiers from other nations, were marked with the harsh realities of trench warfare, artillery bombardments, and overall devastation of the conflict. The Canadian Corps made a significant contribution to this battle. The Battle of the Somme was a large-scale offensive launched, of course, by the British, with General Haig at the helm, and French armies against the German forces on the Western Front. The Canadian Corps, which was part of the British Expeditionary Force, played a crucial role in several phases of this campaign. You can there see a Vickers Mark I crew-served machine gun. One notable engagement involving the Canadian Corps during the Battle of the Somme was the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, which we talked about just a minute ago. We mentioned, and we'll mention more about it as we're coming up, which took place from September 15th to the 22nd. First marked from the tanks warfare, first tanks used in warfare. The heavy fortified German and machine gun positions were fought against hard. The Canadians succeeded in making significant gains, though, during this battle. Their success at Flores Courcelette demonstrated the effectiveness of the Canadian Corps in offensive operations and showcased their ability to adapt to new technologies like tanks, like the Mark I Mail. However, it came at a cost, with a significant number of casualties. Overall, the Canadian contribution at the Somme was part of the larger Allied effort to break the stalemate on the Western Front. While the Battle of the Somme did not result in a decisive breakthrough, it did play a role in wearing down the German army and setting the stage for future offensives. The experiences of Canadian soldiers at the Somme, like those soldiers from other nations, were marked by the challenges of trench warfare, artillery bombardments, and overall hardships of the conflict. The Canadian Corps stationed in Belgium, Canadian forces stationed in Belgium near the city of Ypres, were spared the first months of fighting in the Somme. By the end of August, however, with manpower on the Somme running low, the first three divisions of the Canadian Corps were located to the battle to help with the offensive, still grinding on under the orders of British generals. The Canadians entered the battle on the 30th of August, taking part in a number of bloody attacks from September through November, supported by the first tanks used in action on the Western Front. The Corps captured a series of strategic objectives, including Courcelette, Thiepval, and Encourt Heights. In November, the 4th Division of the Canadian Corps, then fighting alongside British troops, helped capture the German stronghold of Regina Trench. British troops went over the top on the 1st of July 1916, expecting, after the fury of their own barrage, an easy walk onto the German lines. They were met instead by terrible fire from rifles, artillery, and machine guns, seemingly unhurt by the bombardment. This is just in general footage of the battle, first days. The first day of the Somme was a disaster, with nearly 60,000 casualties. No Canadian infantry units participated in this attack, but at Beaumont-Hamel, the 1st Newfoundland Regiment, attached to a British division, was cut down on July 1st by German machine gun fire as it attacked over open ground. Within 30 minutes, the regiment suffered a crippling 324 killed and 386 wounded, out of a total of 801 soldiers. The first day was a catastrophe for the British Army and a shock for all the Allies. Despite the limited Allied gains, German forces had also suffered horribly. The British pressed the attack for months, well into the fall. By the time the battle ended, each side had suffered more than 600,000 casualties. The Somme was one of the war's longest attritional campaigns and remains a source of great historical controversy. Critics suggest that ineffective and callous British generals ordered their soldiers forward in fruitless and costly attacks, giving them neither proper weapons nor effective tactics to break through the enemy trenches. Other historians further suggest that little more could have been done at this stage in the war to achieve victory, and that attrition of German troops along the Somme eased enough pressure from the French at Verdun to ensure the Allied front did not collapse in 1916. The French demands for help, they argue, forced the British to attack before they were ready. Without enough artillery fire or shells to suppress enemy fire, the British suffered staggering casualties. On July 1st, 1916, after 2 years of stalemate, the vast trenches on the Western Front became the Battle of the Somme. The British launched a massive offensive, and this was course, in the Somme River Valley in northern France. This assault, as I've just explained, cost 60,000 men the first day. It was hoped that the assault on a 25-kilometer section of the front would not only break the stalemate, but relieve pressure on beleaguered French forces defending against the long-running German assault further south, and that's at Verdun, as I mentioned. The Somme offensive opened with a massive artillery bombardment which lasted 5 days and did little to knock out enemy troops and artillery guns. The Germans simply hid in their deep reinforced dugouts until the barrage ended, emerging largely unscathed to face the oncoming attackers. Many British shells had also been poorly manufactured and turned out to be duds. Others lacked the fuses necessary. And so all that barbed wire stung across no man's land between the opposing sides had basically pretty much been unaffected. This is the Battle of the Somme here from July to November 1916. So you can see the 4th Army, the Reserve Army, and this is the lines from July 3rd here. And you're looking at August and September 22nd to November, and that's how far they have been able to push forward. These are the lines here from the, you can see British and French. The British are in red and the French are in green. And of course, you have roughly in the position, the red is the 1st Canadian Division. Blue is 2nd Canadian Division. You have 3rd Canadian Division is in the gray, and then 4th back here. So that, and then the Reserve Army in the 4th, that's the British. So this is the British and the French. French line here, British lines here, and how they progressed. So the Canadians, we were here. And this is where over 1 million people, 1.2 million had pretty much had died. One of the largest battles of the First World War. When British soldiers went over the top, their trenches in the wake of the barrage, the result was catastrophe. Tens of thousands were mowed down by machine gun fire. MJ08 15 German machine guns, or caught up in barbed wire, then killed as they tried to reach the German lines. The British, of course, around 57, this says 57,000, but roughly 60,000 killed or wounded on only the first day of this battle, with little to show for their sacrifice. This was also the beginning of the Battle of Albert, from the 1st to the 13th of July, the name given by the British to the first 2 weeks of the 141 days of the Battle of the Somme. So 9 corps of the French 6th Army and the British 4th and 3rd Armies attacked the German 2nd Army, General Fritz von Below, from Fauquecourt, south of the Somme, northwards across the Somme and the Encre to Sire, and at Garmcourt, 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers beyond, in the 3rd Army area. The objective of the attack was to capture the German 1st and 2nd defensive positions from Sire south to the Albert Bapaume Road, and the 1st position from the road south to Fauquecourt. The German defense south of the road mostly collapsed, and the French had complete success on both banks of the Somme, as did the British from Maricourt on the army boundary with the French northwards. 8th Corps took Montauban and reached all of its objectives. 15th Corps captured Mametz and isolated Fricourt. The 3rd Corps attack on both sides of the Albert Bapaume road was a disaster, making only a short advance south of La Boisselle, where the 34th Division suffered the most casualties of any Allied division on the 1st of July. Further north, 10 Corps captured part of the Leipzig redoubt, basically an earthwork fortification, failed opposite Thiepval, and had a great but temporary success on the left flank, where the German front line was overrun, and Schauben and Staff redoubts captured by the 36th Ulster Division. German counterattacks during the afternoon recaptured most of the lost ground north of Albert Bapaume Road, and more British attacks against Thiepval were costly failures. On the north bank of the Ancre, the attack of the 8th Corps was a disaster, with large numbers of British troops being shot down in no man's land. The 7th Corps diversion at Gommecourt was also costly, with only a partial and temporary advance south of the village. The German defeats from Fauquecourt to the Albert Bapaume road left the German defense on the south bank incapable of resisting another attack. A substantial German retreat began from the Fauquecourt plateau to the west bank of the Somme close to Péronne. North of the Somme, in the British area, Fauquecourt was abandoned by the Germans overnight. Several truces were observed to recover wounded from no man's land on the British front. The Third Army diversion at Gommecourt cost 6,758 casualties against 1,212 German, and the combined casualty count with the Fourth Army reaching roughly 57,470, 19,240 of which had been fatal. The French Sixth Army suffered 1,590 casualties, and the Germans' Second Army suffered 10 to 12,000 casualties. Orders were issued to the Anglo-French armies to continue the offensive on the 2nd of July. A German counterattack on the north bank of the Somme by the 12th Division, intended for the night of the 1st and 2nd of July, took until dawn on July 2nd to begin, and was destroyed by the French and British troops opposite. Since 1st of July 1916, the British casualties on the first day and the meager gains have been a source of grief and controversy in Great Britain. For Beaumont and Hamel, the Newfoundlanders were situated on what they call St. John's Road, in a support trench 200 meters behind the British forward line and out of sight of the enemy. Because the communication trenches were congested with dead and wounded and under shell fire, the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hadow, decided to move immediately and into attack formation and advance across the surface. The Essex Regiment on their right flank were visible to German positions at Thiepval, and were therefore compelled to move up through the congested trenches. They did not get into position until 10:50 a.m. The Newfoundlanders were on their own, supported only by some mortar and machine gun fire. The Newfoundlanders started their advance at 9:15 a.m., moving in their pre-rehearsed formation with A and B companies leading in lines of platoons in file or single file at 40-pace intervals and 25 paces between sections, following at 100-yard distance by C and D companies in similar formation. As with breasted the skyline behind the British first line, they were effectively the only troops moving on the battlefield, and were subjected to the full wrath of the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment, manning the positions ahead of the German artillery. A great many fell before they were even crossed the British line. Many more were hit as they picked their way through the gaps in the British wire. With exemplary courage, the survivors picked up their assault formations as best they could, and, with chins tucked down as if walking into a blizzard, continued toward the German line about 400 meters further on. Halfway down the slope, an isolated tree marked an area where the enemy's fire was particularly concentrated. Called the danger tree, a representation of its twisted skeleton now stands at the spot where so many fell on the tragic day, 1st of July, 1916. At 9:45 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Haddow, who had witnessed the destruction of much of his battalion from his headquarters in Sap 4, reported to the brigade commander based in a nearby dugout that the advance had failed. Within 15 to 20 minutes of leaving St. John's Road trench, approximately 85 of those who had started forward were dead, dying, or wounded. Only one other battalion, the 10th West Yorks at Furcourt, suffered more heavily on July 1st, 1916. For many men, however, it was far from over. Isolated survivors continued to engage the Germans from no man's land, and about 40 men, taken under command of Captain G. E. Malcolm of the 1st KOSB, attempted to continue the attack, but were finally stopped just short of the enemy line. Of this, Captain Malcolm, who was wounded, later reported, "I should like to congratulate the Newfoundland Regiment on their extreme steadiness under trying conditions." The tragedy had yet to plan out in full for the 1st Essex. By the time they were in position, the divisional commander had ordered a cessation of all attacks. However, due to numerous communication difficulties, the message did not reach them. The two lead companies attempted to advance and suffered about 250 casualties before their commanding officer called a halt. Few of the wounded lying in no man's land could attempt to retire to safety before nightfall, and many either died where they lay or were subsequently killed by artillery fire or watchful enemy riflemen and machine gunners. Several wounded were not recovered until 4 nights later. Meantime, the remnants of the battalion, along with the reserve that had been held back, continued to hold a part of the line against expected German counterattacks until relieved on July 6th, incurring further casualties in the process, including at least 4 officers on the afternoon of July 1st. When they left the line on July 6th to billets in Eagle Bomber, the battalion fighting strength numbered 168 other ranks. Here, on July 7th, Lieutenant O.W. Steele was wounded by shell fire and died the following day. The Newfoundlanders manned the line again from July 14th to the 17th, by then up to a strength of 11 officers and 260 riflemen. On the 27th of July, with the rest of the division, they entrained for billets at Candace, which stage battalion strength was up to 554. The situation of men lying in no man's land was aggravated by a shiny tin triangle each wore on his back. These were to enable identification by the liaison aircraft and artillery observers. But for men lying wounded or in such cover as they could find, they also signaled any movement to the enemy. The casualties sustained for the opening day, of course, we know 19,000 for fatal, around 60,000 total. The Newfoundland Regiment ration strength on July 30th, 1916 was 1,044 all ranks, including administrative staff and attached personnel. Actual fighting strength was about 929, all ranks, of whom 26 officers had, and 772 other ranks deployed into the trenches. A further officer and 33 other ranks were attached to the brigade mortar and machine gun companies, while 14 officers and 83 other ranks were held back as reserve and for special duties. So far as can be ascertained, 22 officers and 758 other ranks were directly involved in the advance. Of these, all the officers and slightly under 658 other ranks became casualties, but exact figures are not available, as casualties were reported for the day as a whole. Of the approximately 800 men who went forward, only about 110 survived unscathed, of who only 68 were available for roll call the following day. Many soldiers sent reassuring letters home in the days before the battle, although censorship laws prohibited them from saying anything about the Allies' plans. This letter will be very short, for we have been up to our eyes in work for the past fortnight and will be for some time to come, the reason for which I cannot give you even in an inkling, but you will have heard all before this reaches you. Steele wrote to his parents on June 25th. I'm afraid that quite a long time will elapse before you get another letter from us, but you need not worry, for we shall be all right. Private Francis Lynn's letter to the Daily News on July 29th was filled with reassuring bravado, which masked any anxiety or fear he may have had. No pen could describe what it was like, how calmly one stands and faces death, jokes and laughs. Everything is just an everyday occurrence. You are mud-covered, dry and caked, perhaps, but you look at the chap next to you and laugh at the state he is in. Then you look down at your own clothes, and then the other fellow laughs. Then a whiz-bang comes across and misses both of you, and both laugh together. On the 24th, the Allied powers bombarded the German front lines with artillery. The barrage lasted a week before the offensive and was intended to weaken enemy defenses in advance of the July 1st ground attack. So going back to just a little bit before, so you can see where Beaumont Hamel is and what the carnage would be, on July 1st, and as well as throughout this entire sector. At 9 p.m. on June 30th, the regiment departed Louvencourt and marched 3 hours to its trenches on the battlefield. It is surprising to see how happy and lighthearted everyone is, and yet this is undoubtedly the last day for a good many. Steele wrote in his diary. The various battalions marched off whistling and singing, and it was a great sight. Of course, this is the best way to take things and hope for the best. The battleground was a 34-kilometer ribbon of land near the River Somme. Allied trenches stretched along one side and the Germans along the other. In between lay no man's land. The Germans held much of their front in great strength. They had created a 3-tiered system of forward trenches, which was well dug in, shielded with extensive protective wire, and capable of surviving sustained bombardment. Beyond that, at ranges between 2,000 and 5,000 meters, the Germans had constructed a second line of trenches and were working further back on yet a third. This network of heavily defended lines presented a formidable obstacle to any attacking force. And of course, this is talking about some of the Newfoundland Regiment, and they're going up to what had happened. The Newfoundland Regiment was stationed in trenches near the French village of Beaumont Hamel. And so we talk about Beaumont Hamel and what happened that day, which lay behind enemy lines. It was a strategically difficult position. The German front lines were about 300 to 500 meters away, down a gray slope and heavily guarded by barbed wire entanglements. And of course, that was where the German 119th Reserve Regiment. They were tough and experienced and had turned the natural defenses of a deep Y-shaped ravine into one of the strongest positions on the entire Somme front. So the Newfoundland Regiment's assignment, along with the rest of the 88th Brigade, which they were assigned to, was to seize control of the German trenches near that village of Beaumont-Hamel. The regiment would be part of a third wave of attacks to leave Allied trenches, and some of the worst. They were nearly destroyed. Well over 700 casualties. They lost most of their combat force, their combat strength. When the offensive began on the 1st, Allied forces bombarded the Germans with heavy artillery for an hour. And at 7:20 a.m., they detonated more than 18,000 kilograms of explosives under Hawthorne Ridge. And there's a video of that. You might have seen it on one of the videos here on this presentation. The ridge was an important German stronghold on its front line, about 700 meters to the west of Beaumont-Hamel. The blast turned the area into a great crater, measuring 40 meters wide and 18 meters deep. And that's a famous photo of Hawthorne Ridge Mine. In the preceding weeks, Allied commanders had debated whether to detonate the explosives 4 hours before the ground attack, 2 minutes before the attack, or at the very moment the soldiers left their trenches. A compromise set the detonation 10 minutes before 0 hour. The timing was a terrible mistake. The explosion alerted the Germans and that a land attack was imminent. Well, the 10-minute delay gave them just enough time to strengthen their defenses and ready their machine guns. As the first wave of Allied troops left their trenches at 7:30 a.m., of course, they were greeted by the devastating barrage of enemy artillery and machine gun fire. And certainly that was the case for Beaumont-Hamel and the 1st Newfoundland Regiment. It was far stronger than the British or French had anticipated, and Canadians, and Newfoundlanders for sure. Most men were killed or wounded in minutes. A second wave of troops left their trenches soon after and met with the same fate. And of course, that was the Newfoundland Regiment that was on the third wave of the attack. By 8 a.m., there was considerable confusion along the Allied lines. The first 2 waves of the attack had been devastating failures, but the British commanders received conflicting reports from the battlefield, making matters even worse. Divisional commanders mistook German flares for a signal of success from the attacking 87th Brigade. At 8:45 a.m., Brigadier General Douglas Edward Cayley ordered the Newfoundland Regiment to advance. And that's where so many of that regiment was written off and killed. With the numerous flaws in the Allied strategy, of course the week-long bombardment being one of them that preceded the attack, it certainly had not weakened the German defenses that were hardened against prolonged, consistent attacks. Instead, it had an unexpected effect of leveling the landscape of no man's land, which deprived the advancing men of any cover from artillery, from enemy fire, from machine guns and snipers and artillery. But halfway down the slope between the British and German trenches, however, a blasted apple tree did survive, and that was the danger tree. And that's for Beaumont-Hamel. It became a rallying point for the men of the Newfoundland Regiment who had made it to no man's land. The tree only provided meager cover, and the men became silhouetted against the sky as they approached it, making them easy targets for the German gunners. Many men died near the danger tree, including Private Francis Lind. He was 37 years old. The few men who did reach the German lines were horrified to discover that the week-long artillery barrage that preceded the attack had not cut the German barbed wire. Allied leaders had already obtained this information thanks to a series of raids that reconnaissance teams had carried out in the nights before the attack. However, commanders had dismissed the reports convinced that the raiders were inexperienced and that the artillery bombardment was much more effective than it actually was. As a result, the majority of the soldiers who reached the enemy trenches were killed and tangled in uncut wire. When at 9:45 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Haddell received that the attack had failed, he received initial orders to gather any unwounded men and resume the offensive. But wiser counsel prevailed, and the order was countermanded. Thank God. Throughout the day, survivors tried to make the long and dangerous journey back to their own lines, dodging enemy snipers and artillery fire. Private James McGrath lay on the battlefield for about 17 hours before he finally made it to safety. The Germans actually mowed us down like sheep, this soldier told the Newfoundland Quarterly. I managed to get to their barbed wire where I got the first shot, then went to jump into their trench, and when I got the second in the leg, I lay in no man's land for 15 hours, and then crawled a distance of 1.25 miles. They fired on me again, this time fetching me in the left leg, and so I waited for another hour and moved again, only having the use of my left arm now. As I was doing splendidly, nearing our own trench, they again fetched me, this time around the hip as I crawled on. I managed to get to our own line, which I saw was evacuated, as our artillery was playing heavily on their trenches. They retaliated and kept me in a hole for another hour. I was then rescued by Captain Windler, who took me on his back to the dressing station, a distance of 2 miles. Well, thank God my wounds are all flesh wounds and won't take long to heal up. Better than the best, he says. The attack was a devastating failure, of course. In that single morning, we know the casualty figures. Some say 20,000, dead, but 60,000 the first day, and another 37,000 wounded. Each report has its own, casualty figures, but say still was 60,000 the first day. The Newfoundland Regiment had been wiped out, almost. When roll call was taken, only 68 men answered their names. 324 were killed, or missing, or presumed dead. In total casualties, 386 were wounded. So, 386 wounded, 324 were killed. So casualty figures out of around over roughly 900 men. That's renders the first Newfoundland Regiment combat ineffective. The following days brought more fatalities. Lieutenant Steele had survived the Beaumont-Hamel offensive, only to be hit by a German shell on July 7th outside of the regiment billets. He died 1 day later. This here picture is the danger tree nearing the German trenches. This here is where they had hid, and many had died right at there, right in that section. Here's another map of the ravine. Hawthorne Ridge Cemetery is number 2 here. The different cemeteries from the Somme. Y Ravine Cemetery, and the German trenches and British trenches. British trenches here, British trenches here, German trenches up here. And these are the interpretive signs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Caribou Monument for the, I believe that is for the Beaumont-Hamel and Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And Beaumont-Hamel plunged Newfoundland and Labrador into a period of mourning after this. Casualty lists appeared in local newspapers, but information came in slowly from the front lines, and it was often incomplete. Many families had to endure a few tortured weeks of wondering whether their loved ones were alive or dead. British officers sent letters of condolences to the many families who had lost sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers, and Allied leaders publicly praised the Newfoundland Regiment. Among them was Sir Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces. Newfoundland may well feel proud of her sons. The heroism and devotion to duty they displayed on the 1st of July has never been surpassed. Please convey my deepest sympathy and that of the whole of our armies in France in the loss of the brave officers and men who had fallen for the Empire, and our admiration of their heroic conduct. Their efforts contributed to our success, and their example will live. This is from the Evening Telegram, July 21st, 1916. The first Memorial Day ceremony took place in downtown St. John's 1 year after the battle. In the 1920s, the Newfoundland government bought the ground over which the Newfoundland Regiment had fought. The memorial park it established at Beaumont Hamel became a place of pilgrimage for people wishing to honor and mourn the regiment. And here is the caribou. Today, July 1st remains an official day of remembrance in Newfoundland and Labrador. I mean, every year people gather at the National War Memorial in downtown St. John's and at other locations across the province to remember the soldiers who fought at Beaumont Hamel, as well as the many other men and women who have served in other forces and other wars. And that's Newfoundland's War Memorial at Beaumont Hamel Park in France, July 1938. The Battle of Courcelette, of course, was on. Next major battle included in this was the Courcelette, September 1916. So on the 15th of September, Canadian soldiers launched a large-scale attack, capturing the remnants of the village of Courcelette and holding their new ground in the following days against German counterattacks. During the attack, Canadian soldiers used a new military tactic that would eventually solve the riddle of the trenches in later engagements, known as the creeping barrage. And that's important because that was definitely used as a key piece in Vimy Ridge. Canadians walked behind an artillery assault that steadily advanced across German lines, keeping enemy soldiers in their dugouts until the Canadians were on top of them, enemy lines, and ready to fight. Before this intervention, soldiers would wait for their army's artillery bombardment to end before charging across no man's land and into enemy guns. And that was certainly the case at Beaumont Hamel in July 1st. The Red Chateau was basically the only standing building left in the French village of Courcelette during the Battle of the Somme in October 1916. So through September and October. Courcelette, and this is Courcelette, September 1916. You have the Germans, so we have the Canadian Corps, the 11th Division, 15th Division, the British, and you have the Canadian Corps, Canadian units here, 3rd Canadian Division, 2nd Canadian Division, and them attacking here. And it's the 45th Reserve and the 4th Guard Division and the Guard Reserve Corps of the German Army, 26th Reserve Division. So this is where our guys are, alongside the British. The creeping barrage certainly became a massive key in the First World War. On September 15th, 3 divisions of the Corps launched an attack on German lines to capture the ruined remains of the small village of Courcelette. 2 innovations helped the troops in their assault, and rather than wait for their army's artillery bombardment to end before charging across no man's land into enemy guns, the Canadians walked behind a major creeping artillery barrage that steadily advanced across German lines, keeping enemy soldiers in their dugouts until Canadians were on top of the lines and were in position to start taking taking out the Germans in dugouts. Tanks. The first tanks in battle, of course, the Mark Ones, the Mark One males. Um, Ones from here, you can see um, the grenade cover, which prevents grenades from being thrown in. So the grenade cage. Then you have the two 6-pounder guns on the sides, and then you have the steering wheels in the back. The first tanks were pretty much the first some of the first armored vehicles. They were called the land ships. These are some of the first tanks ever made. They were rudimentary, but they were very. This was just the start of a massive military invention that would prolong a development of such a massive vehicle. Um, it was the world's first tank, tracked and lightly armored, but armed and to enter combat. Of course, the tank was a code name to maintain. It was the name tank was initially a code name to maintain secrecy and disguise its true purpose. The tank was developed in 1915 to break the stalemate of trench warfare. It could survive the machine gun and small arms fire in no man's land, travel over difficult terrain. Um, it could it could do a lot of. It could crush barbed wire. It could cross trenches to assault fortified enemy positions with powerful armament. It's amazing. These are tanks also carried supplies and troops, and it could also be. They're basically like a giant moving pillbox. Um, so the Mark One, the first ones were the Mark Ones, and then you come up with different Mark Twos, and then improvements Mark Threes and Fours and Fives and Sevens and Eights. Um, these are certainly just the first of something that's going to be awesome. They have a crew of 8. The Hotchkiss 6-pounder QF guns are for the Mark One males. The female had 4 303 Vickers machine guns. And of course, the secondary armament, the male had a secondary armament of 303 in Hotchkiss machine guns. And the female had 1 303 in a Hotchkiss machine gun as well in secondary armament. I mean, the main gun of these was 105 horsepower. The main engine was 105 horsepower. Yeah, and so the main guns, you got your two 6-pounder guns. Um, the max speed is roughly 6.0 kilometers per hour maximum. So basically, you're walking or kind of jogging speed. I mean, it's the first tanks, and these were all one compartment. You had guys coming out that were puking from the fumes. They were very noisy. Um, Even though they were incredible, they were great. I mean, the prototype was called Mother, and it mounted just a single 57 millimeter cannon and a Hotchkiss machine gun. So we went into battle with the latest attempts to break the trench deadlock. Of course, the tanks. We had 6 land cruisers, the Mark Ones, as they were then called, um, entered into history's first major tank battle at Courcelette. Um, An additional tank was kept in reserve. Although slow, plodding, and difficult to move, the large and imposing tanks were an effective psychological weapon against the Germans. Each tank was run by an officer and 7 men. Also assigned to each tank were 5 infantrymen tasked with the removal of casualties ahead of the vehicles. Only one of the tanks reached its objective during the battle. The rest were either disabled by shell fire, mechanical failures, or stuck in an obstacle. Still, tanks were able to roll over barbed wire and trenches while firing machine guns and artillery. This capability struck fear and caused some Germans to surrender at the mere sight of them. If hell is as bad as what I have seen at if hell at seen at that location, if hell is as bad as what I have seen at Courcelette, I would not want my worst enemy to go there. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Louis Tremblay, 22nd Battalion. At 06:20 on the morning of the 15th of September, the 2nd and 3rd Divisions attacked German lines outside of Courcelette. Accompanied by one tank and following behind a creeping barrage, they overtook the German trenches and a sugar refinery by 8 a.m. Later that day at 6 p.m., 22nd Battalion, French Canadian, and the 25th Battalion, Nova Scotia Rifles attacked and captured the village through hand-to-hand fighting and with the help of 2 tanks. The Germans mounted several counterattacks, which the Canadians pushed back for 3 days and 3 nights. While it was a rare Allied victory in the Somme, the advances at Courcelette cost several thousand Canadian casualties. For example, of the 800 men of the 22nd Battalion who took part in the initial assault, 118 remained after 3 days of fighting. The first 3 divisions of the Corps continued fighting on the Somme in September and October, suffering about 20,000 casualties overall after weeks of continued attacks and counterattacks. The 4th Division, fighting alongside British infantry, captured Regina Trench, an important German strongpoint. Canadian casualties at the Somme numbered more than 24,000 by the time the campaign was called off. And that's out of the 1.2 million casualties overall. When heavy rain, mud, and snow finally put an end to the Somme campaign in November, an estimated 1.2 million men from the German and Allied forces had been killed, wounded, or captured. The campaign produced no significant gains in territory, but the enormous bloodletting did inspire innovations in military thinking that in the coming year would help the Canadian Corps and the other Allied units find ways to solve the stalemate of the trenches. Canadian officer C.G. Barnes recalled the heavy losses that were typical of the battles of the Somme offensive. We went in about 40 strong to a platoon, 160 to a company, and if you brought out 40 or 50 men out of a company of 160, you did well. They weren't all killed. They were wounded, but out of action. The Germans had these cement redoubts stuffed with machine guns, and you've got to go over to get them knocked out. You had to circle and come in behind them. Well, 75% of your men are knocked down before you can get in there. Rain and snow finally brought an end to the battle, of course, in November. After 5 months of fighting, the Allies had only penetrated about 13 kilometers along a 25-kilometer front. Allied losses were estimated 614,000 dead and wounded, of whom more than 24,700 were Canadians and Newfoundlanders. The German losses were estimated 440,000. Here's one of our Canadian autocars, Brunel autocars of the First World War. The seemingly pointless slaughter in the Somme led to questions and severe criticism of Allied leadership, and certainly General Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Forces, of which both the Canadian Corps and the 1st Newfoundland Regiment were part of. But the offensive's failures had also sparked new thinking about military tactics, including designs of shells, better planning, coordination among attacking forces on the battlefield, and the importance of allowing small groups of ordinary soldiers to exercise leadership and personnel initiative. So flexible chain of command, and being able to change operational planning and objectives if need be, in life or death. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Aaron Boma, military specialist for Carleton County. This concludes this presentation.